Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Evan Osnos. I'm a non-resident fellow here at the China Center. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion of the domestic politics and issues influencing the Obama-Xi Jinping relationship. I think for obvious reasons, this is an extraordinarily appropriate moment to be having a conversation about domestic politics. It occurred to me that perhaps President Obama might not mind the idea of a few days, a few thousand miles from Washington, D.C. this week, given the results in the newspaper this morning. But in thinking about it, I think we also want to remember a comment from Wang Qishan, member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, as relayed by John Huntsman, U.S. ambassador to Beijing, who said in this forum a year ago, he said, Wang Qishan told him, don't forget, we in China also have our politics too. And I do think it's important to remember that. Indeed, they do. And we have a terrific group today. Couldn't ask for a more knowledgeable group to help us decipher and anticipate some of the things that will be important to be thinking about. Very briefly, I'll just introduce them. I think you have information in your program. David Shambaugh, at the end, is a senior non-resident fellow at the China Center and, of course, also a professor at George Washington University, where he runs the China Policy Program. Susan Lawrence is a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. She lived in China for more than a decade, interviewed Jiang Zemin, for which I'm very jealous, and now also specializes not only in Chinese politics, but also in what's happening here, and she'll be able to tell us more about that today. And then, of course, to my left is Chung Lee, who really needs no introduction at this point. But I am very grateful to him for having us here today and for convening this discussion. And if it's okay, Chung, we'll start with you. You have the floor.
Well, first I want to echo what you said. It's really a wonderful panel. You know, David has been my academic brother, Sixiong. Really has inspired my research on Chinese politics. And Susan has not only helped me in my research on public health in China, but also has been a candid critic of some of my naive views or ideas. I really appreciate that. And Evan has just joined our China Center as a non-resident fellow, who really brings new ideas, fresh perspectives of upcoming generation of China watchers. It's so nice to have you here. Now, I want to focus on Xi Jinping in my 7 minutes. I believe that the international media coverage of the APEC and the Xi-Obama summit will give a great deal of attention to President Xi, partly because he is the host, partly because that while Obama has only 2 years in office, but Xi just finished his first 2 years in office, supposed to have another 8 years. But mainly because there's a great deal, great need to better understanding Xi Jinping, his leadership style, the strengths and the constraint of his power, and his policy agenda, and his worldviews. Now, unfortunately, there have been many misperceptions and poorly grounded, narrowly minded kind of assumptions of Xi, not only outside the world, but also within China, in my observation. I would like to address 3 prevailing assumptions about Xi. Number 1, many people in China and abroad believe that Xi Jinping's power has already surpassed Deng Xiaoping, and he will even become a Mao-like figure. Second, Xi Jinping has already determined his politically conservative agenda. And some Chinese and foreign analysts argue that in Xi Jinping's vocabulary, this is a direct quote, in Xi Jinping's vocabulary, there's no such word called compromise. And thirdly, Xi Jinping has already altered Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy, particularly in terms of a friendly and cooperative relationship with the United States. He became very firm and sometimes very critical and may really challenge U.S. leadership and etc. Now, despite some truism in each of these 3 assumptions, I think they are largely misleading and may make U.S. policy towards China ineffective. Let me very quickly mention each of them one by one, just very quickly. First, Xi Jinping's power has already surpassed Deng Xiaoping, and may also, whether he like or not, that maybe he's really interested to become a Mao Zedong-like figure. Now, yes, Xi has launched a very strong anti-corruption campaign, which really boosted public confidence and support for him, contributing his strong image as a strong and decisive leader. Yes, she not only she actually holds, as we know, 10 positions in the party, government, military. It's quite remarkable. This is also considered that it seems like he has monopolized all of the power. Yes, she has undermined the power of the premier and not to let him to speak in some occasion. Traditionally, premier should deliver, and etc. Not even in the draft committee, for the third plenum, etc. But all of these kind of observation can be just temporary, in my view, largely due to the fact that he has a majority support in the Power Bureau Standing Committee, which is 6 versus 1. Only Li Keqiang belonged to Hu Jintao's camp. So that gives him tremendous power. Or you can argue that because he has very strong allies, as you mentioned, Wang Jisan, and or at the time that the people really tired of the previous leadership, Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, considered too weak. They want to have a kind of strong leadership, and for the time being. Now, it is important to point out that in his final year, Deng Xiaoping did not have any leadership position except the title as honorary chairman of the China's Bridge Association, poker, association. But no one at that time doubted that who was the boss, right? So this is someone said that in this country, you have this kind of position. It's not a sign of strength, but could be a sign of weaknesses, the sense of insecurity. You can even argue that. Now, it is one thing for the Chinese public to want to have a strong leader, but it is quite another thing to conclude that China is ready for another Mao. It's quite a different thing. Now, in my observation, Xi Jinping has confronted many daunting challenges: social, political, economic, demographic, foreign policy. These challenges themselves are overwhelming. But at the same time, he deals with the leadership that okay, I see the 2 minutes. It's not so easy to change the nature of the collective leadership. Now, I will go back to in the Q&A. Secondly, Xi Jinping, the argument or perception that Xi Jinping already determined his political conservative agenda, and he will not compromise either domestic and foreign policies. Now, yes, Xi Jinping has adopted what I call political conservative and economic liberal approach in his policy agenda. Yes, he has controlled the media, and sometimes I think that his kind of Maoist approach alienated a lot of intellectuals, and his market reform agenda alienated conservative intellectuals. And also, his proactive and assertive foreign policy may make some of the Chinese neighboring countries very nervous. These are all true. But again, his politically conservative approach could be considered as a kind of sense of sequence. At the moment, he needs to uplift his popularity through his economic reform, strong anti-corruption agenda. Then when he gets capital, he could start some of the political reform. You can argue that whether it's true or not, we do not know. Right? And also, Xi Jinping does show some flexibility and a compromise in many cases. And for time concern, I just very quickly mention some of them. For example, in recent party meeting, he called for judiciary reform, even judiciary independence. That's the things he previously rejected. And also that in handling student protests in Hong Kong, that he actually allows the dialogue and allow the students to stay in the Zhonghuan, not like someone suggested should close before the fourth plenum or before the APEC meeting. So at least this is a compromise, although maybe too small. And also in the CICA summit last May, in the Yaxing meeting, that he said the United States, Asia should be Asia's Asia, really undermined U.S. leadership. But now he no longer uses that rhetoric. He basically gave up. And also we know that in July, that the China announced that the number 981, the oil drill, actually withdraw, and earlier than supposed to be. These are all the signs of compromise. Now, finally, Xi Jinping has already changed Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy, or particularly in terms of the friendly or cooperative relationship with the United States. Now, I just want to give you some specific examples that he may change certain aspects of Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy, but because of rapid change of international environment. But it's highly inappropriate, at least for far too premature, to talk about that he is kind of even anti-US, as some Chinese observers believe. Now, I'll give you some examples. That first of all, that in my observation, he has most of his foreign friends are Americans. He is famous for his love of American popular culture, Hollywood movies, and sports stars, and some of the novels. And his wife was heavily involved with Bill Gates Foundation on AIDS control and the tobacco control, AIDS prevention. And the fact that he sent his daughter to study at Harvard for 4 years. These are all the sentiment or the testament showing that the kind of his friendliness approach to the United States. And again, I don't want to go to detail. In terms of concrete example, that more than any other previous Chinese leaders, he is very forthcoming and critical about North Korea. Certainly, it's also a big challenge to the United States that North Korea nuclear proliferation. Now, in conclusion, my main point is that there's nothing certain and about or predetermined in terms of Xi Jinping's domestic and foreign policies. In the next few years, Xi Jinping needs to decide what kind of leader he wants to become, and what kind of what legacy he wants to pursue, and what direction that China is heading. Now, so for the United States, it will be wise to work with him, rather than just think that he's a person we cannot work with. This will be really undermine American interests. I think the upcoming summit is a really great opportunity for President Obama to capitalize that Xi Jinping's desire to be a transformative leader. So I think that we just want to make sure that transformative leader also better serve the interests of U.S.-China relation, and the U.S. can provide some help and support if he's moving to the right direction. Thank you.
Terrific. Chung, thank you very much. I think you've forced us already to challenge some of our assumptions about Xi Jinping, and I'm sure we'll return to those later. Susan, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Chung and to the Thornton Center for the invitation to speak here, and to Evan for the introduction. I should note that my comments today are my own and don't necessarily represent those of the Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress. That said, the midterm election yesterday changed the makeup of Congress with potential implications for issues in U.S.-China relations. I work for the U.S. Congress, so I thought I would use the minutes allotted to me to highlight the role of the U.S. Congress in foreign policy, and specifically in China policy. The Constitution divides foreign policy powers between the President and the Congress, so they share in the making of foreign policy. The Constitution doesn't say which branch should have the final word, an issue that's now before the Supreme Court. The President is usually seen as in the driver's seat for much of foreign policy, but when Congress chooses to do so, it can have a very significant role in shaping foreign policy. With a hat tip to my former CRS colleague, Dick Grimmett, there are 6 broad ways that Congress makes foreign policy. They include 1, legislation to set objectives and guidelines, 2, resolutions and policy statements. The most common are sense of the Congress statements, or House or Senate or concurrent resolutions, which are not legally binding. Legislative restrictions, placing prohibitions on presidential freedom of action or on foreign policy, sometimes through funding denials. Oversight through hearings, investigations, reports, legislative pressure, informal advice. All those come to play in China policy and play into the dynamics of an event like the Obama-Xi meeting next week. Just thought I'd give you some examples, starting with legislation to set objectives and guidelines and direct the administration to undertake specific activities. Perhaps the most influential such legislation in the US-China relationship is the Taiwan Relations Act, enacted in 1979. It includes the provision that the United States will make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. Basically, the Taiwan Relations Act ensures that arms sales to Taiwan remain a major issue in the US-China relationship. Another example of that kind of legislation directing the administration to undertake activities is something in the current Congress. We have a law that has directed the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to obtain observer status for Taiwan at the International Civil Aviation Organization Assembly, ICAO. China saw that law as a gross violation of the One China policy and the principle of the 3 Sino-US joint communiques. Other sort of big, broad legislation that directs the US-China relationship, the US Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. It declares, among other provisions, that democratization is a fundamental principle of US foreign policy, and that this naturally applies to US policy toward Hong Kong. Also, the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002. Among other things, it requires the President and the Secretary of State to encourage dialogue between the Chinese government and the Dalai Lama or his representatives, leading to a negotiated agreement on Tibet. It also requires the President and the Secretary of State, when they meet with Chinese government representatives, as President Obama will do next week, to request the release of political and religious prisoners in Tibet and seek access for international humanitarian organizations to prisoners in Tibet. So these kinds of legislative directives obviously play a role in preparations for any high-level meeting between the United States and China, including, we can assume, next week's meeting between the 2 presidents. Resolutions and policy statements. There are lots of these, just a few examples from the 113th Congress, from the current Congress. We had Senate Resolution 412, setting forth U.S. policy, supporting allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific region, opposing claims that impinge on the rights, freedoms, and lawful use of the sea, managing disputes without intimidation or force, supporting development of regional institutions to build cooperation and reinforce the role of international law, and ensuring continuity of operations by the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific region. Obviously, implications for U.S. policy on the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Separately, Senate Resolution 361 condemned actions taken by China to suppress freedom of the press, and it urges the President to use U.S. influence to support the free flow of information to the people of China, including through the internet and other electronic media. Resolutions aren't always critical of China. Senate Resolution 115, sponsored by Senator Warren, commended the heroism, courage, and sacrifice of victims of the Boston Marathon bombing, including the Chinese student Lu Lingzi. And it included language saying that Lu Lingzi is a reminder of our common humanity and that senseless acts of terrorism, such as the bombings that occurred during the running of the Boston Marathon, are crimes that have no borders. Another category, legislative restrictions. Appropriations Acts for 2013 and 2014 barred NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy from using appropriated funds to collaborate in any way with China or with any Chinese-owned company, except in certain circumstances. The National Defense Authorization Act for 2014 stated that PRC missile defense systems should not be integrated into the missile defense systems of any of the US or NATO, a reference to Turkey, which was considering buying Chinese systems. Another category is oversight, hearings, investigations, reports. Often Congress will request the administration officials to testify before Congress and clarify administration policy, sometimes on subjects on which the administration, left to itself, might prefer not to speak out publicly. We had 2 hearings this year on Taiwan, noting the 35th anniversary of the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act. One hearing in this House, one in the Senate, during which administration officials were pressed on such issues as arms sales to Taiwan and support for Taiwan's membership in international organizations, Taiwan's role in the rebalance, and so on. We've had many other hearings on aspects of the rebalance, foreign purchases of US food companies, human rights in China, the posture of the US Pacific Command, and many other issues. And finally, of course, there are some ways in which Congress influences foreign policy and what it doesn't do. So, for example, it hasn't passed the IMF quota and governance reforms that would increase the IMF quota share of developing countries, including China. It has not so far reauthorized the Trade Promotion Authority for the President. I'll stop there.
Susan, thank you. I have to say, I take back my statement earlier that the president was leaving Congress by going to China. I think Congress will be with him every step of the way. It's quite clear. David, over to you. And thank you, Susan, very much.
Thanks, Evan and Chung, for inviting me to be part of today's really fabulous program. In my allotted 7 minutes, and I know it's 7 minutes because my student Jingjing is sitting in the front row with the signs that count down. And Jingjing, you may want to remember the grade I gave you in your midterm. If I can buy a couple of extra minutes as a result. Anyway, in my 7 minutes, I'd like to sort of describe China's domestic internal scene as I see it, and then end with a few observations on what that might mean for the U.S.-China relationship. Some of what I think Chung has already said, and we share many views about China in common, so I might reinforce some of what you've already said. Might disagree slightly with a couple of things. So let me, if I can kind of encapsulate the way I see China's domestic scene today, I would do so in the Chinese metaphor, Wai Ying Ne Ran. Hard on the outside, soft on the inside. That's a metaphor that I think is quite apt, because if you look at China today internally, for some of the reasons Chung has just given, there are a number of indicators that show strength of the system on the surface, but I would argue not under the surface. I see pervasive weaknesses throughout the system under the surface. So that's sort of my takeaway argument. But let's start with the strengths and Xi Jinping. Again, I share some of what Chung said. He is certainly a strong leader, and he's trying to consolidate his control over various various bureaucratic systems, indeed the whole system. He is not a weak apparatchik, such as his predecessor Hu Jintao was. He's not a coalition builder, as Jiang Zemin was, bureaucratic coalition builder. He's not a withdrawn, fickle, and tyrannical leader like Mao was. He's much more like Deng, but without Deng's authority. Deng, of course, built up his authority over several decades. Xi has not had that benefit yet. He's trying, I would argue, to assert his authority without really building it. And he doesn't inherit it, really, either. But he's certainly trying to assert it. He's trying to assert it, first of all, over the military, which is critical to any Chinese leader's position and longevity. He's done so in several ways. First, by touring all military regions and a number of bases within his first year in office. Only Jiang Zemin had done that previously. Hu Jintao, that was a big mistake Hu Jintao made. He never paid attention to the military, and it cost him. But Jiang Zemin did so immediately, right out of the gate. And he gave some very tough speeches during those first 6 months. And if you examine and read those speeches, there's one phrase that is used repeatedly. Quote, prepare to fight and win wars, unquote. I have a student who did research on these dozen speeches and found something like 15 references to that phrase. Obviously, the purge of Xu Cai-ho for corruption cases, for his corruption case over bribery, that's a major signal to try and assert his control over the PLA. He's also asked for loyalty pledges from the officer corps in the PLA, and then last week, astonishingly, they had this meeting in Gutian in Fujian, in which the entire Central Military Commission, all the senior brass of the PLA convened in this revolutionary site and, again, sort of pledged their support for Xi. So I would say Xi's, assertion of authority over the PLA is pretty successful so far, from what I can tell. Over the state council and government apparatus, I would say the whole third plenum reform was a big effort to do that. Chung has referred to the fact that Li Keqiang was not even on the drafting committee, but he certainly didn't chair the drafting committee, which he should have done in an ex officio way. So Xu Cai-ho tried to assert control over the government apparatus there, and subsequently, and over the party, finally, through the mass line campaign that began last summer, and certainly the anti-corruption campaign that's been ongoing now for a year and a half. But I would say in all these areas, except in the PLA, I don't see any real indications of the PLA. We are, though, seeing signs of pushback against, against the third plenum reforms. It doesn't mean it's necessarily against Xi, And it's rather predictable pushback. China may not be a democracy, which it certainly isn't, but it certainly has, as John Huntsman said, interest group politics, and it certainly has bureaucratic politics, and it has entrenched interests, and it has a lot of so-called iron rice bowls that don't want to be broken, and it has a lot of corruption. So a lot of the third plenum reforms, I think it's pretty widely viewed. I'm not an economist, but they've bogged down. They've never really gotten out of the starting gate. A few, yes, but most, no. I would say there's somewhat of an arbitrary nature in this anti-corruption campaign. On one hand, it is an anti-corruption campaign, but I would first of all argue it's a campaign against the manifestations of corruption, the so-called 4 bad work styles: hedonism, bureaucratism, formalism, and extravagance, right? It's not against the sources of corruption, which are quite different and more difficult for them to tackle. But the point I really want to make is this anti-corruption campaign is partially anti-corruption, but it's also partial purge. This is a political purge that's taking place. And it's a purge of whom? It's a purge of Jiang Zemin's network. This is highly risky, in my view. If I was advising Xi Jinping on how to build your power base in the party, you don't go after the patron godfather while the godfather is still alive. Jiang Zemin is still alive, and this network is pervasive throughout the PLA. Shu Cai-ho was central to Jiang Zemin's PLA network, and it's pervasive elsewhere. So it may well cause some, it's causing pushback, I think, and it could, we're going to have to see how it unfolds, but it could be dangerous for Xi. He's also broken the collective decision-making norm that they have worked for the last 25 years assiduously to cultivate. He's a very singular decision maker. He's taking lots of decisions apparently on his own, not even with consultation of the rest of the Politburo. One reads. I don't have any real empirical evidence for it, but he's a strong leader, and he's a strong leader with a vision. Okay, this is a man who has a good sense of self and where he wants to go. And I just remind us all, 2 years ago, on the eve of the 18th Party Congress, all of us analysts were saying China needs a strong leader with vision, right? Because Hu Jintao had not had either. So we've now got a strong leader with vision. That's probably a good thing. But I would just indulge Jingjing for one more minute if I can. He's sitting on, I would argue, a quite volatile, very frustrated, and unstable society. The economy is beginning to stagnate. China's caught in the middle income trap. It's not making much progress on the whole macroeconomic transition that they outlined in the third plenum and before. There's overcapacity, overproduction, growing debt levels. I'm not an economist, and you've already talked about that, but so that's one source of instability: economic, ethnic instability, highly volatile. Xinjiang, Tibet, and one can argue maybe Hong Kong is volatile. I don't know if it's unstable. So the reaction of Xi Jinping and the party to this volatility and instability has been what? It's been repression. We've had, I would say, China is now it's the most repressive that it has been since the aftermath of the June 4th event in 1989, in the early 1980s. It's gone from bad under Hu Jintao to worse under Xi Jinping. Media, social media, dissent, intellectuals, civil society, all cracked down upon very hard and being squeezed. So this represents to me insecurity of the regime, not security. This is an overreaction, and this is what I mean by soft on the inside. The party has a real sense of the volatility of their society and the problems in their own party. So I would argue that these repressive, harsh measures are not the act of a confident, comfortable government, just the opposite. So what does this combustible cocktail mean for the United States? Let me end on that point. I think we need to be cognizant of China's weaknesses, China's insecurities, and China's volatility. We are not dealing here with a stable country or a secure regime, in my view. Quite to the contrary. So just because Xi Jinping and Wang Qishan and these others look kind of strong on the outside, they're not, or the system is not on the inside. And if you look at the system systemically and compare it to other authoritarian and previous communist systems that fell from power, you see a number of similarities. I'm not predicting the Chinese Communist Party is about to fall from power tomorrow, but there are a number of systemic similarities to the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and other authoritarian states in East Asia. So just bear all that in mind. We're not dealing here with a strong state. We're dealing here with a very weak state, I would submit.
David, I can't let you go far after saying that. We have a lot to, I think, pursue, and that was a fascinating view of how it looks to you. I wondered if I can follow up with you. So you've described a state that is going into a summit meeting with the United States in a position of some anxiety on the Chinese side. How does that affect their decision-making when it comes to the United States? Can I push you a little further on the U.S.-China relationship? If they have this many things on their agenda at home, if the things that are keeping Xi Jinping up at night are domestic concerns, what does that do to his relationship with this country?
Well, I think they're walking on two legs with the United States, as Chairman Mao used to say at the time of the Great Leap Forward. One leg is the leg that Deng Xiaoping set them on. They don't need problems with the United States because they have so many problems domestically and regionally that if they find themselves in a confrontational relationship with the United States, it's only going to exacerbate all these other frictions. So they really, in some ways, that's the Tao Guangyang Hui approach, pacify the U.S.-China relationship. But the other leg, I would argue, is building or try to build pillars or points of support in other parts of the world. And those points are with Moscow, with the BRICS, in South Korea, in Central Asia, and then there are some hardy perennials like Pakistan, and with Brazil. So China's sort of has an alternative set of diplomatic approaches that have nothing to do with the United States, but in a way they do, because they're trying to build China's global power base, if you will. I don't know if that's the right word, alternatively to the U.S. They don't like the American order. And then I guess the last thing I'd say, Evan, is they see a weak United States, right? Probably the same way that I just described China. If you had this session in the Tsinghua Center of Brookings, about the United States, maybe before the election or after election, they'd probably say the same thing. Weak country, all kinds of internal problems, can't control its foreign policy, budget deficits, polarized politics, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, we're kind of mirror image of each other.
Chung, you've described Xi Jinping as perhaps a more flexible figure than the unexamined image of him would be. Drawing on what David said, how does this look to you? Do you think he is in a position to make substantive progress with Barack Obama in the relationship?
Well, at the moment, he's very popular. He got support from general public, got support from middle class, got support from military in general. Maybe some of the senior military officers may have some different views, but that's a tremendous resources for him. And certainly the leadership actually at the moment almost give him a blank check at the moment.
How do you think he's going to cash that check on? What are his priorities, do you think?
There's a risk. I agree with David that you have these 10 positions. If something went wrong, you cannot blame others. You cannot blame Li Keqiang. He was not involved. And so that's a tremendous pressure on him. Mm-hmm. But I think that also tells us there's a great opportunity. How could you imagine that he announced that the summit failed or the APEC failed? No, can't be successful. So successful, you need to through some negotiation. Mm-hmm. And my point is that in contrast to some of people think that he's stubborn, he's determined, he's preoccupied with something, I do see the other side, the flexibility, to seize the moment. And he was good at that. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a good chance that we will reach some of the agreement and etc. But my worry is exactly what he said early on. The public opinion, quite nationalistic, partially related with some of the leaders, blame everything to the United States. Now they need to pay a cost for that. And so that's a very, very tricky part. That constraint, he could not be seen a leader to compromise China's interests, although at the moment he is not seen that way, despite the fact that from many evidence that he is quite pro-US. Otherwise, you will not send your daughter to study in the United States. You will not have so many American friends, like your former boss, Hank Paulson, and etc. I can give you a long list, but I don't want. And so that's
So a more personalized politics also makes him personally accountable. Susan, how does this look to you?
I wanted to jump in on the factors, the domestic factors in China that might be affecting the Obama-Xi summit. I mean, it seems like the instability in Xinjiang has clearly led to much greater Chinese interest in counterterrorism cooperation, and that's now very much part of the US-China agenda in a way that it wasn't, even a year ago. I think that China, it seems it's very worried about pandemic disease, sort of causing all sorts of problems in China. Having been through the SARS experience, I lived through the SARS experience. It was really quite a searing experience. I don't think China wants any kind of repeat of that, so they are very, very keen to sort of cooperate and do what they can on Ebola. And you've seen Chinese teams going out to Africa to set up treatment centers, and China's going to send the PLA. And it's a great opportunity for US-China cooperation, but it's also very much in China's interests. And finally, there are many examples, but I would say actually the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty, that is something that Xi could use to deal with a lot of this internal pushback that he's getting on some of the reforms. If he's able to say, look, we're working on this BIT with the United States. China has a history of using these international agreements or negotiations to try to sort of pull domestic forces into line. Maybe he could do that with this. Maybe that's part of the Chinese change in attitude towards the BIT that we saw starting in July. And just kind of picking up on Cheng's point about Xi, I mean, I think there is a debate about how do we see Xi? Is he compromising in those examples? Is he being flexible? Or are we just seeing real confusion in Chinese foreign policy? And there are some people who would say that actually it's confusion. I mean, that we're seeing policy statements which don't add up, or that sometimes in the same speech, one idea is put out and then it's contradicted later on, or these big initiatives get thrown out and then nothing happens. So is that because we don't have a national security leading small group up and running and doing what it was meant to do? Is that the problem? Or is it more that he's compromising and being flexible? Just kind of throwing that idea out there.
I think the same.
Same?
Well, the inconsistency is also flexibility. Anyway.
Or confusion.
Because still earlier, he cannot continue forever, but the early period, still second year, it's facing serious challenges. He needs to position himself. So in a way, it's not, you can see the reason for that.
And on this panel, inconsistency is a virtue. We reward it. We're going to go in just a moment to questions. In fact, if we're ready, I think let's go ahead and do it right now. Please wait for a microphone, and if you can, make sure that you ask a question rather than make a comment, and we'll start right there.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. You've talked about the flexibility, particularly up to now, regarding Hong Kong. There's increasing speculation there that as soon as the international attention and the cameras move out of Beijing at the end of this meeting, that there's going to be a crackdown on these demonstrations. What is your estimate on how long they're going to allow this thing to continue before they just decide to clear it out?
Well, this is a good question. It is a possibility. And I was in Hong Kong last week. I talked to an entrepreneur, a very prominent entrepreneur, Chinese entrepreneur living in Hong Kong. I said, it's not over yet. He said, what do you mean by not over? He said, I haven't started yet. The whole things of the request for, civil liberty and democracy, justice, just start to emerge in Hong Kong and to a certain extent, probably later on in China. So it's a long-term challenge. So he needs to, at a certain point, he needs to seize the opportunity to make some initiative. When you're under pressure, he will not compromise, you can see, or only compromise in a small way. This has happened too early on, that also there's a lot of criticism of C.H. Tung early on. Then at the moment that he supported him, but later on, the Beijing and try to take advantage to make some initiative, then change the leadership. So I was see that Xi Jinping certainly don't want to be seen as Hong Kong is a failure, and because this is related with Taiwan, and in 2 years, and related with many other issues. So he could not afford to be seeing that failure. But at the same time, that also that national sentiment will make him to be a little bit cautious. So what I'm saying is that yes, he still has some room for compromise. He wants to seize his moment, his opportunity to change. But early on, you said whether he will clean the square, he should. I don't think at the moment he has made up his mind yet. He will see the reaction and short-term and mid-term, and with a calculation to see the public opinion. Now, ironically, that Xi Jinping is popular, as I mentioned early on, among the Chinese public and among the middle class, may not necessarily popular among the elites and officials. But in Hong Kong case, just opposite. He probably is popular among the Hong Kong elites, but alienated the grassroots people. So that's also quite a challenge for him, or embarrassment for him, if he do not handle in the right way.
Why do you think he's not as popular among elites on the mainland?
Well, you have such kind of anti-corruption campaign. Mm-hmm. Second, as Susan said, you confuse them. One day you say A, mm-hmm. Second day you say B. Mm-hmm. So these officials are so confused. Mm-hmm. So what they should do? Mm-hmm. So that's alienation as well. Now, David said about the vision, and I hope that Xi Jinping has a vision. I'm still very, very hopeful. But that vision was not clear to many officials in China.
I think the vision has been put forward in kind of three ways. In fact, I was going to bring today the copy of Xi Jinping's selected works, which has just been published a couple weeks ago. I'm proud owner of a copy, which the cover of which looks more like Kim Il-sung's collected works than Xi Jinping. Nonetheless, I mean, the vision is in some ways in that book. I mean, he's given a lot of speeches on a lot of different topics. They're in there. It's also in the so-called China Dream rhetoric discourse that has emerged since he came into office, and it was in the Third Plenum Reforms. That's a big part of the vision, and it was in the speech he gave on day 2 on the job at the National Museum on Tiananmen Square, where he led the Standing Committee of the Politburo over to look at this Road to Rejuvenation exhibition, the Fuxing Zhilu Jianlan, in the National Museum. And that was a very important speech, set of comments he gave there, very tough, actually. So he put all these together. There's a 2-year track record of speeches and enunciations that I think do comprise a vision, in fact.
Does that vision give us any sense of how you think he will respond to Hong Kong?
I'm surprised, and maybe the question, I don't really want to speculate about Hong Kong, but the way you pose the question is interesting. Once the cameras clear out of Beijing, we'll see the fist in Hong Kong, if that's how I understood it. Sort of similar to the Gorbachev visit in '89, and then came the fist. I don't know. I think his assumption, it's hard to read this leader's mind, but I think the Chinese Communist Party's predilections towards Hong Kong would be to clear it out, immediately. And the fact it's festered for as long as it has must cause great anxiety and angst inside the Politburo, and but they're caught, because if they do just clear it out, then they've got world public opinion to deal with, and cameras, and not to mention the one country, two system framework. They've already lost. The one thing you can say about Hong Kong is they've already lost Taiwan as a result. There is no incentive on the island now, if there ever really was, to buy into this one country, two system.
And he was willing to do that because he had no choice, in effect. I mean, there was no option for Xi Jinping that would have allowed him to salvage this Taiwan relationship in a meaningful way.
Taiwan, well, he inherits, Taiwan relationship, and Richard Bush, I think, is somewhere here.
Yep, he is right here, front row.
That's the one accomplishment of Hu Jintao's. You look at 10 years of Hu Jintao, Chinese say 10 lost years. Well, I would argue the one real accomplishment of that decade was the cross-strait relationship. So Xi Jinping inherits that. He hasn't done anything directly to Taiwan to undermine what he's inherited, but what he's doing in Hong Kong, my point, is undermining the Taiwan, the one country, two systems formula for Taiwan.
Let's go back to the audience here. Yep, just on this side of the aisle.
My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. In this moment, I just wonder about human rights. And I'm comparing the Obama and mainland China, the Tiananmen Square and things like that. I just wonder, the current teenager Nobel Prize saying Obama should not arm the world. And Obama, at the beginning, want to stop Gitmo detention, but he failed. And in Obama want to prosecute the financial institution and auto industry, but they say they are too big to fail. So I think what we have instead is NSA surveillance. We have a CIA surveillance, warrantless search. We have that kind of airstrike. Are we going to lose all our human rights compared to mainland China? How are they going to talk to each other now?
Well, let's take it as a basis for a question on human rights in this visit. I think we've heard that there has been a crackdown in China. How high on the list on the agenda do you think human rights concerns will be? Susan, do you have a feel for that?
I mean, it's obviously on the agenda, and this is always the question when you have a bilateral relationship that includes so many different issues, where do you put human rights, and does human rights get onto the agenda? Obviously, it is on the agenda, and the president, I'm sure, will be making statements on what's been happening in China. It is, I mean, a lot of people argue that this is the fundamental gap between the US and China, the fundamental friction between the US and China is the different political systems, different approaches to issues like human rights, that China doesn't buy into the civil and political human rights. It focuses on the economic human rights. And I don't see us being any closer to resolving that difference, resolving those frictions. I mean, the US continues to speak out on these issues. China continues to feel that this is unwarranted interference in its internal affairs. And also, I guess China worries that in this, coming back to this theme of instability and fragility, that US advocacy for democracy and human rights is fundamentally threatening to Communist Party rule. And that's a pretty fundamental difference between the two countries.
Well, certainly it's a part of American values, American foreign policy. I think we should stay with that. We should not be shy. But how to deliver? And I think that you usually should do that in a way as a dialogue rather than lecture China. Now, I noticed that there will be no press conference, no public,
Joint statement.
Yeah. So I think this time may not be the right timing to push, but I think privately, certainly you should discuss that. But again, discuss that not as a former law professor, but rather as an African-American president. Talk about our own experience, as Jeff constantly mentioned, that it's China's best interest to improve. If we want to endure, long-term stability and progress, these are fundamentally important issues.
Right here.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. I have a question about the flexibility that you talk about for President Xi and maritime security in East Asia and his relationship with the military. Do you see any flexibility on that, or is he, in his efforts to try to get control over the Chinese military or greater control over it, he's yielding on whatever their goals may be for East Asia, which leads to a continuation of the tension with Japan and in Southeast Asia on these maritime issues?
Well, David is an expert, but let me start. So far, the old evidence shows that he is in charge. He fired Xu Caiho, the person controlled military personnel for 10 years. He probably also fired another former, arrested purge and one after another. So he is in control, and the military for the past 2 decades or so really under the civilian leadership. But as we know that there's expectations there will be new announcement about the military leadership change, then this will be very, very interesting to watch, that who he will promote, whether these people promoted goes through the regular channel respected among the military officers. If not, it creates some potential problems. But in terms of maritime issues, I think that we really have a different perspective, because Chinese, they think they were put into a corner. They are not the party to be to initiate all these disputes. It's Japanese started, rightly or wrongly. This is their perception. The United States backed Japan, caused all these tensions. So this is their mindset.
Yeah, I think we should leave this question to the next panel. We don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of the next panel.
All right. I think our panel should be applauded for its self-discipline in all things. Right there, please.
Thank you. This is Jacob from George Washington University, and really thank you for your sharings. And I have a question about the mutual distrust between China and U.S. How do you think the domestic politics played the role in the mutual distrust, and how would you see the leadership's dialogue would resolve this issue? Maybe it relates to the image that Mr. Chambers said, but how would you deliberate more on this issue? Thank you.
Right. Well, I would agree. First of all, there is profound and pervasive mistrust in the relationship across the board. And in fact, in my blog post associated with today's meeting, I discussed this, the sources of it and the manifestations of it. But your question is about the domestic political sources of that mistrust, or that domain. And I would agree with what Susan just said. From the Chinese perspective, there is profound mistrust of the United States because they perceive the United States as trying to subvert their system and to overthrow the Communist Party. If you don't believe me, just read Central Document number 9 of last year, and a book that's come out, it's been reissued now, the Liuge Weisheng, the 6 Whys book, and the Qiga Buyao, the 7 Don't Want book. The propaganda campaign is actually intense, but it's also extremely revealing about the way the Communist Party thinks about the United States. So they really profoundly distrust what they perceive to be American actions and intentions. Now, the American government, if you ask the American government, do you perceive subversion from China? I don't think you would get a positive answer, but you certainly do in the other way around. So that's a source of mistrust. There is I would go so far as to say there is an ideological competition between these two countries. Many people say, oh, ideology died with the Cold War. We don't have an ideological conflict between each other. Baloney. We do, over models of governance, global governance as well, this domestic governance, over human rights, and over the staying power of the Communist Party. So I think your question is a good one. We have mistrust in the Asia-Pacific region. We have mistrust in the economic domain, the security domain, the military domain, the economic domain, but we also have it in the domestic political domain, is my view. And it's not going to go away as long as the Chinese Communist Party has all these insecurities and sees the United States as trying to either exacerbate them or actually undermine their position, their rule.
So is there anything, in fact, that the United States can do, or what can the United States do to provide that kind of reassurance?
I don't think we can. We can say publicly, and President Obama can say privately, we are not trying to undermine your rule, but the Chinese Communist Party won't believe it. I think we should say it publicly, so we're at least on the public record, and that some of that public record will actually trickle into China, and some Chinese might actually read that. If it'll be blocked, but it'll get through. But basically, this is a DNA kind of assumption on the Chinese part about the U.S. It goes all the way back to 1955 and John Foster Dulles. It's not new.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this gets to one of the interesting questions about Xi Jinping, which I think, Chung, you alluded to before, that in some ways he has a cultural affinity for parts of the United States. His daughter's studying here. He's talked about the importance of Western pop culture and things like that. Does this message of distrust, to the degree we can figure this out, does it begin at the top Or is this the kind of thing that if he's going to address it, he has to address it later in the list of priorities? Do you think that he has a fundamentally distrustful relationship with the United States, or do you think he believes this is a partner?
Well, I think that he needs to wait and see, because otherwise he will be put into a corner that if U.S. policy really challenge China's interests and make him like the person, not tough enough to defend China's interests. So he needs to draw a clear line. But I think that at least some of the people, surrounding him are sophisticated enough to understand that there's a containment in China. The reality is more complicated. But the public opinion now feels that way. I do believe that we also should, United States, should also review our policy, our delivery to China. Why the large population in China, particularly young people, feel that there's a threat, there's a containment, and that kind of feeling, that sentiment is on the rise. It's dangerous, and I think that certainly promote educational exchanges and a think tank like us to play an important role, try to challenge this kind of perception. But we should establish a different kind of mechanism to do that. I always believe that why the relationship did not go wrong, because of the personal ties, especially like Wang Jisan. 30 years ago, he developed a very close working relationship with American business people that made him to understand better about the American domestic politics and economy. I hope this kind of multi-layers kind of connection and association will ultimately prevail. But at the moment, there's a danger.
We'll go back to the audience in just a second. But Susan, I was struck in this midterm election that we did not see the kinds of advertisements that we have in recent years in previous races, these kinds of very xenophobic anti-China ads basically saying the Chinese are coming to take your job and such leader is not doing enough to stop that, or some version of that. We didn't see that. Do you have a sense that there is any movement at all in the kind of message that circulates in American politics about China right now? Is it moving in one way or another, or was this just an aberration?
I do think we are definitely seeing ads talking about outsourcing of jobs and that sort of thing. It's just not China specific, right? I think I work right next to the Capital South metro station. And the Capital South Metro Station is currently plastered with advertising against Fast Track, the trade promotion authority for the president, and it's lots of messages about how trade undermines the average American and leads to lost jobs and lost incomes and so on. So there's a bigger narrative in American politics, I think, about some of the risks associated with trade, and of course China is a huge trading partner of the United States. But I think the maritime disputes have been very damaging to China in terms of its image, both with the US administration and with the Congress. I think China's human rights record is something that the Congress has always taken a particularly strong interest in. China's human rights record, partly I think out of a sense that maybe the administration sometimes, with the administration, human rights can get lost in the shuffle, so therefore the Congress has an obligation to try to make sure that it stays on the agenda. And so the whole range of developments that we've seen in the last year have not helped China's image on the Hill. I guess I'm not seeing a profound change in the political discourse.
All right, my attempt to find a bright spot did not succeed. All right, we're going to go right back there to that far right. Thanks.
Hi, Joe Browder. At 3 events in the last year about China at other institutions, after the events, Voice of America people have come up to those who attended and started asking questions like, how could you believe a word they said because they are communists and communists always lie? Or how could you care about what they say about the environment because they're poisoning their own people? This is Voice of America correspondence. So if you were a Chinese person overhearing this very loud and very obvious attacks against the Chinese from an outfit of the U.S. government, wouldn't you wonder if perhaps there were some anti-Chinese thinking going on somewhere in the levels of government?
Any concern up here about Voice of America and how it's received in China?
I would at least base your perception on actual transmissions of the Voice of America rather than overheard conversations in the hallway. It's not a very reasonable example.
Right here in the second row, please.
My name is Dolma, and I'm Tibetan, so really good to hear about human rights and all that. But to be more cosmopolitan and, after getting education and guidance and, whatnot, besides the ugly stuff, I would, I lost my train of thought. What I mean to say is the human rights and all those things. For me, like being here today, I see a lot of youngsters, Chinese, and I hope we are all originals, from there, not like, one in DC and one in, Beijing and one in Guangdong, that kind of stuff, which I'm sure the elderly ones here know about those trade of the current state of the world. So the human rights thing, I think it sounds too obsolete or too minute to be talking about. But since Dalai Lama, I'm not trying to take his credit, but he seemed to be the ones who are among the great leaders to be looked up and to seek guidance by many great leaders still. Do you think on the broader issue, Tibet will be used? I mean, from my personal minute observation, I feel that damage is done.
I encourage you to get to your question.
Yeah, my question is, do you think, or any of you guys, if you could shed some light on whether Tibet could be used as a platform to still try to curb what a lot has been done for decades and decades, McDonald's and all that, it's so scary. So do you think, and then encourage the other nations to stop, using or eating each other in terms of our ISIS?
I think let's talk about Tibet for a second. Do you think Tibet is, where's Tibet on the agenda for a visit like this? Does it still have the place that it has had historically, or is it not there anymore?
I think Tibet's on the agenda. I mean, the US has made a number of statements over the last year about developments in Tibet. I think the self-immolations among Tibetans is an issue of profound concern. I think the Chinese policies of the Communist Party's involvement in religion, this sort of thing, I think the US is definitely going to be. It's something that is of a continuing concern to the US. We have a policy on Tibet. It's sort of interesting because we have a lot of programs. We have programs that are focused on Tibetans in Tibet. We also have a lot of programs that are focused on the Tibetan refugee population in South Asia, in India and Nepal. And there's actually a lot that the US government does to support the refugee population. A lot of appropriations go that way, scholarships, other sorts of activities. But yes, the US has pushed for a long time for dialogue between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. That's been stalled since 2010. It's not looking very optimistic in terms of getting those negotiations, dialogue back going again.
There was a brief reference to the fact that unrest in Xinjiang may create an opportunity for U.S.-Chinese cooperation on perhaps on anti-terror activities. You remember that when the leader of ISIS named the countries that he believed were targets because of their treatment of Muslims, China was at the top of the list. What kind of opportunities does that create for cooperation between the U.S. and China today? Do you see counterterrorism as a place where there will be meaningful cooperation? Yeah, David.
I think, Evan, it's a tremendous opportunity to be grasped by both sides, but particularly the Chinese side, because there's a direct linkage between their terrorism problem in Xinjiang, and let's be very clear, China has a terrorism problem. The Uyghurs, whatever their cause, however worthy their cause may be, the tactics they are using are terrorist tactics. So that's real. And there's a direct linkage from Xinjiang through Central Asia, through the Caucasus, all the way to Syria. So China is very directly affected by this. There are 100 Chinese citizens, many of them Uyghur, in ISIS-controlled territory today, according to the Chinese embassy. That's where I get that figure. And so there's obviously reason for China to be involved in it. The question is whether China will be involved. So far, they have not become involved in any real, as I can tell, any tangible or even rhetorical way. You know, we are seeing once again what I call the risk aversion, the kind of, not head in the sand, but the sort of Chinese position on global hotspot issues, global crises, whether it's Libya, Syria, where they exercise a double veto twice with Moscow. You know, and here we have yet one more very serious challenge to many countries. And that's why there's a coalition of 23 countries that are doing things and taking military steps to combat ISIS. China can be part of that coalition if they decide to be, and I would hope and invite China to be part of that coalition, but so far we haven't seen it, and that's, I would hope, very high on the agenda for discussions in the Great Hall of the People between our two presidents.
Well, it's not only just a Uyghur or minority, but actually it's somewhere between 50 to 100 Han Chinese join, the terrorist group in the past few months. Now, the issue is about the religion. We do see the contradictory, kind of phenomena or trends. On the one hand, you see the tight crackdown, and even on religion, and the Catholic Church in Zhejiang province just demolished a lot of churches and there. But at the same time, you see Xi Jinping wanted to, invite the Pope to visit China. There's some dialogue going on. And also related with Tibet, I noticed that His Holiness Dalai Lama expressed that his hope that Xi Jinping will take initiative. And but I think it must be some dialogue going on between his special envoys with Chinese government. But also in light of the Xinjiang situation, I don't think Chinese government is going to lose its control. I think there will be things were getting worse in that area in terms of control and etc. But maybe Xi Jinping, under this kind of environment, hopefully he will try to have some breakthrough in other front of religion. He cannot just alienate all the religious group. This means, 100 million people or more. And so we do not know. So I think that at the moment he's leave a lot of ambiguities, but sooner or later, in terms of matter of years, he needs to directly address that issue.
Say that I think on counterterrorism, I think maybe we should be thinking about this a little more broadly. China has expressed a willingness to get a whole lot more involved in Afghanistan, and that, in some sense, is a counterterrorism measure in just the idea of supporting Afghanistan and ensuring that it doesn't fall back into a state where it would become a breeding ground for terrorists and have that kind of activity spill into China. That's something China's concerned about. You have seen China stepping up and getting more involved there. So that's an example. There are a lot of others, but I think counterterrorism, it seems to be sort of on the agenda.
I'm afraid we are out of time for this event, but please join me in thanking our panel for today.
Thank you.